There is one country where 43.9% of married couples report zero sex. In another, most people don't lose their virginity until well after 23. And believe it or not, there's a country where sex is practically non-existent. We're taking a peek between the sheets in this episode of the infographic show, Countries That Have the Least Sex. Number 10. Vietnam. Vietnam's economy and society has transformed rapidly in recent decades, but when it comes to views on sexuality, especially for women, tradition still runs deep. Studies by Gameltoft and Huang and Zuo in the 2010s found that young women remaining virgins until marriage was still an expected social norm in Vietnam. That's why parents often emphasize the importance of not having sex before marriage to their daughters. In rural areas of the country, if a girl has sex before marriage, it can harm not only her reputation, but that of her entire family. As for other discussions about consent and safe sex, those conversations never take place. Vietnam's version of the birds and the bees tends to boil down to don't have sex. Simpler but much less educational. Reliable data on sexual activity in Vietnam is hard to come by, especially as they don't talk about it. But one study from the 2000s found that among unmarried people aged 22 to 25, just 33% of men and only 4% of women in urban areas reported having premarital sex. In rural areas, the numbers are even lower. Sure, some respondents were probably being a little shy with the truth, but even so, Vietnam ranks near the bottom globally when it comes to sexual activity. Also, the average age for loss of virginity in Vietnam is 19.7 years old, which is on the higher end globally. The previous study found that the proportion of women in their sample who were sexually active by the age of 20 is much lower than the proportions in the Philippines, Thailand, and all 32 countries in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, which is science speak for everyone's getting laid more than Vietnam. Number 9. India. For a country that brought the world the Kama Sutra, they sure don't seem to be excited to practice it anymore. The average Indian citizen loses their virginity at almost 23 years old, compared to the average global age of 18.4 years old. In a study across 45 countries, India ranked the lowest in average number of sexual partners, just 3 per person. Compared that to 9 in the global average, according to a 2005 Durex survey. And who knows more about sex than the company relying on it for their income? So what's behind India's low sex drive? First of all, it's important to keep in mind that India is huge, made up of so many different regions with vastly different cultural attitudes. But overall, many subcultures in India are still very conservative when it comes to sex, especially in rural areas. Only 34% of people in India believe sex before marriage is morally acceptable, and the expectation that women should stay virgins until marriage is still relatively common. There's also a Hindu tradition that states that sex should only happen during a woman's season, or in Ritu, a 16-day window in her menstrual cycle. Well, except for the first 4 days, and then the 11th day, and the 13th day. If you're doing the math, that's only 10 days of a menstrual cycle left for sex. Considering that around 80% of Indians practice Hinduism, and some follow this rule, that's a pretty significant number of people with a built-in limit. So it's not exactly shocking that Men's Health India reports Indian men are having sex less than once a week. Bobby Varkey has his own theory about why that's the case: the amount of multi-generational homes in India. The Pew Research Center found that 54% of people in India live with their extended family or in joint family arrangements. Getting in the mood to have sex with your wife when your grandma is 2 doors over and your 2 nephews are running around outside is a challenge. Between all the timing rules and a serious lack of privacy, it's honestly a miracle anyone in India is having sex at all. Number 8. China. China has several problems when it comes to sex, or rather, the general lack of it within the country. Particularly when it comes to heterosexual sex, the biggest problem being there's just not that many women. The country's infamous One-Child Policy Act lasted from 1980 to as recently as 2015, after China realized that its population was growing way too quickly for its taste. It encouraged couples to have one and only child, and by encouraged, we mean forcibly sterilized and aborted pregnancies that would go beyond the one-child rule. Unfortunately, sons were traditionally preferred, seen as future breadwinners or more useful on farms, so some couples aborted female fetuses until they had a boy. This created a massive gender imbalance that still exists to this day. In fact, China has the biggest gender imbalance in the world. In 2020, there were 34.9 million more males than females in the country. And since statistically most of that male population is straight, that leaves a massive chunk of the population with far fewer potential sexual partners. The imbalance is reflected in the average number of sexual partners per person. China averages just 3.1 sexual partners per person, making it the second lowest in the world. The average age for losing virginity is 22.1, and while China is often seen as a symbol of modern progress, especially in tech and business, attitudes towards sex remain surprisingly conservative. According to NAPLAB's Global Promiscuity Index, only 29% of Chinese people believe sex before marriage is morally acceptable or not an issue at all. Number 7. Taiwan. Taiwan has the lowest birth rate in the world, sitting at 1.11 children per woman on average as of 2024. But it's not because they're having really safe sex. In fact, the Formosa Cancer Foundation found that 67% of Taiwanese people have sex without a condom. The only reason there aren't more babies and STDs floating around is because they're barely having any sex at all. One study also found that the average Taiwanese person has sex 78 times a year, almost 20 times less than the global average of 96 times per year. Expats often note that sex and dating just aren't high priorities for the many young people in Taiwan. Instead, the focus tends to be on studying hard, landing a good job, and building financial stability. In a culture where intergenerational households are common, there is a strong social expectation for children to support their parents in old age. So securing a solid income takes priority over romance. Even as adults, many Taiwanese find their dating lives heavily supervised. It's not just due to more conservative attitudes, it's also because a lot of them are literally sleeping in the room next door to their parents. A 2016 survey by Taiwan's Ministry of Interior found that 33.5% of people over the age of 20, about 6.33 million adults, still live with their parents, and 1 million of them are over 35 years old and married. The huge emphasis on educational achievement, career security, and helping out family puts sex really low on most people's to-do list. Number 6. Indonesia. There's a simple reason for Indonesia's relative sexlessness. Premarital sex was recently made illegal altogether. The threat of a 1-year jail sentence generally puts a damper on people's libido. Indonesia has been experiencing a rise in religious conservatism in the past couple of decades, leading to more support for the law and more criticism of premarital sex. According to the NAPLAB survey, only 2% of Indonesians believe premarital sex is morally acceptable or not a big deal. So if you do it, expect judgment, and lots of it. The social pressure is now backed by law. Under a recent legal change, even cohabitating couples can face up to 9 months in prison if anyone in their family snitches on them. Unsurprisingly, a country that wants to jail people for premarital sex isn't exactly welcoming toward the LGBTQIA+ community either. In conservative regions like Aceh, men caught in same-sex relationships have been publicly caned or flogged as a punishment. Given all that, it's no shock that Indonesia ranks the third lowest in average number of sexual partners among 45 countries studied, just 5.1 per person. Honestly, we're surprised that it's even that high, all things considered. That said, studies suggest premarital sex in Indonesia is significantly underreported, especially among women who face harsher consequences like public shaming, forced marriage, and even induced abortion. While only 4.4% of women reported having premarital sex, the actual number is estimated to be closer to 22%. And Indonesia is also home to some cultures with some distinct views on sex, like the Dani of Irian Jaya. Among other interesting beliefs they have surrounding sex, they believe in a 4 to 6 year postpartum abstinence. Perhaps all of that put together is why Indonesia has the second highest average age of virginity loss in the world, at 23.6 years old. The highest? Number 5. Malaysia. Malaysians lose their virginity later than anyone else in the world, at an average age of 23.7. Cultural norms play a big role, but so do the laws. Like Indonesia, Malaysia makes it illegal for unmarried Muslim citizens to have premarital sex or even meet privately behind closed doors. Those who do face up to 6 months in prison and sometimes even public punishments, like 3 Malaysian women who got caned in 2010 for having sex outside of marriage. While these laws don't apply to non-Muslims, 2/3 of the Malaysian population is Muslim, so it does govern a fair amount of the population's sex lives. But for everyone else, the culture still isn't super open about sex. The Malaysian Education Ministry has been encouraging students to submit written pledges saying they won't have sex before marriage, which is a weird thing to include in a curriculum. So what happens after marriage? Do Malaysians end up having more sex then? Not really. Shockingly, cultures where people are generally shamed about sex before marriage don't end up feeling that great about it after marriage either. Malaysian paper says found that 46% of couples in the country had sex 1 to 3 times a month after marriage. As for same-sex sex, forbidden by law. So if that's happening, and it definitely is, we're not seeing it in the stats, because admitting that could land you in jail. Number 4. Singapore. In Singapore, the problem of sexlessness has gotten so bad that it's brought about government intervention. A 2003 survey found that Singaporeans had the least sex of all countries, and while that has been changing over the years, the nation is still a little prudish. In the 1980s, particularly worried about the fact that well-educated women were remaining single longer, the government established the Social Development Unit, or SDU. Its function was to hold events like dinners, outings, and even nighttime cruises to get single people mingling. The percentage of single women in their late 20s jumped from 40% in 1984, the year the SDU was founded, to 64% by 2017. So it is safe to say that the program hasn't exactly been a roaring success. Strangely enough, part of that may lie with the government itself. It seems that Singapore is only interested in promoting sex among straight, well-educated, married, preferably Chinese people. Professor Tamara Luce says the government is really worried that Singaporean Chinese aren't reproducing at the same rate as the Malays and other groups. But the government is very intent on cracking down on many of the other forms of sexuality. Singapore had laws against homosexuality until 2022. Shockingly, only for men though. But that's not all. The government also has laws against pornography and even oral sex. However, the law does allow for oral sex as a part of foreplay. Who is checking any of this and how is a detail that we would rather not know or think about. Still, Singapore's strict regulations around desire, sexuality, and yes, even nudity probably aren't helping people pair off. Residents can even get fined for walking around naked in their own homes. For a country perceived as very modern and highly developed in other areas, Singapore is surprisingly conservative about a lot of aspects of personal and family life. And even when couples do finally get together, that doesn't mean smooth sailing in the sex department. A 2024 study by KK Women's and Children's Hospital found that 54% of Singaporean women of reproductive age reported poor sexual function, well above the global average of 41%. From low desire and lubrication issues to conditions like vaginismus, many women aren't enjoying sex or even physically able to prepare for it, leading many to avoid it altogether. Poor sexual function can have many causes, but in Singapore, strict attitudes towards sexuality combined with stress, anxiety, and depression are all contributing factors. Women in particular tend to bear the brunt of those challenges as they are disproportionately affected by cultural and social pressures surrounding sex. Number 3. South Korea. As of 2024, South Korea has the second lowest birth rate in the world, edged out only by Taiwan. At 0.75 births per couple, the country is producing babies at well below the replacement rate. But that doesn't mean that South Koreans are sexless, right? Perhaps they're just having really safe sex. Pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly, who were very curious about global sex habits, surveyed 13 countries. They found that South Korean couples over the age of 34 have the least sex of all, just 1.04 times per week on average. Multiple studies show that married people typically have more sex than singles. So if even South Korea's married couples are barely having sex once a week, that is a problem. Eli Lilly's study also found that 44% of South Koreans said that they'd made up excuses to avoid sex with their partners, and a full 48% had recently experienced rejection by their partners. That's compared to only 33% for all the countries studied. As opposed to other countries on the list, South Korean society doesn't have many moral issues with sex before marriage, so what's happening? One factor many experts blame is South Korea's intense, some may say incredibly toxic and unhealthy working culture. While it may have contributed to the country's fabulous economic growth over the last few decades, it has torpedoed people's sexual appetite. On average, South Koreans work just over 1,900 hours a year, making them the 5th hardest working nation among OECD countries. For context, Americans, often seen as the gold standard for overworking, clock in around 1,800 hours. After a literally endless week at the office, who has the time or the energy for some sexy time at home? Add to that fact that many South Korean adults say they rarely saw affection or love modeled by their parents. This is largely due to traditional values of marriage as a duty rather than an emotional partnership. Professor Lim Chun-hee works for the Department of Child and Family Studies at Kunsan National University. She says the meaning of marriage in contemporary South Korea is more of a union between families rather than of individuals, placing greater value on materialistic values rather than love or affection. That's why South Korea comes in second globally when it comes to completely sexless marriages, with 35.1% of married couples reporting no sex at all. That's compared to 20% around the world, according to a 2016 survey by the S Clinic in Seoul, a sex clinic in South Korea. In fact, It is the only sex clinic in South Korea, which might be an indicator of how badly things are going there. Number 2. Vatican City. Before we get to our true number 1 spot, we want to give an honorable mention to the Vatican City. This micronation is the most sexless country in the world, mainly because their 882 inhabitants are mostly banned from having it. Vatican City's residents include the Pope, cardinals, Catholic clergy, and their support staff. And since clergy are bound by religious vows of celibacy, sex is off the table. And as for heterosexual sex, good luck with that. Only about 5.5% of the population is female. Most of them are nuns or administrative staff. So it's pretty much a no-go zone. But because Vatican City is such a unique case and has fewer residents than your average New York apartment building, it didn't take the number 1 spot. That goes to number 1, Japan. For a country with a fair amount of sexualized entertainment, fewer and fewer people in Japan report having any sex in real life. It's gotten so bad the Japanese media has a term for it: Sakusu Shinai Shokugan, or celibacy syndrome. The Journal of Sex Research conducted a survey for 2022 among over 8,000 people in Japan and found that 45.3% of women and 44.5% of men reported having no sexual partners at all during the past year. Of those that did, the average Japanese person reported having sex only 45 times a year, or 3.75 times a month. That's compared to the global average of 96 times. More than that, 15.3% of women and 19.8% of men reported they had never had any sexual activity of any kind in their lives. Since the survey was administered among people 20 to 49 years old, this was a bit of a shock for the researchers. However, the problem manifests very differently for men and women in Japan, partly due to the rampant problems with sexism in the country. Men, especially those 20 to 29, watched pornography at least 3 times a week. And though only 26.9% of men around the world report ever having paid for sex, 48.3% of Japanese men report having paid for sex in their lifetimes, almost double the international rate. On the other hand, the Japan Family Planning Association found that 45% of women between the ages of 16 to 24 were not interested in or despised sexual contact, and just over 25% of men agreed with that statement. Experts believe the sexless crisis is the result of several factors. One is a culture of overwork coupled with economic stagnation and less financial stability, something that makes men feel unable to fulfill their traditional roles in Japanese society. Meanwhile, the corporate culture actively discourages women from getting married. Their chances of promotion plummet upon marriage, and 70% feel that they must leave their jobs after their first pregnancy. So the country is caught in a push and pull between tradition and modernity, with neither gender feeling that they can fulfill either type of role. This results in both sexes running in different directions away from each other, which may be why Japan leads the world in sexless marriages, with 43.9% of couples reporting they have no sex at all, compared to the global average of 20%. Now, you might be surprised that some countries, especially those known for being oppressive toward women and their sexuality, aren't on this list. But the truth is, a lot happens behind closed doors, and in many cases, the average age of marriage is low and women often have limited ability to refuse sex, meaning sexual activity may be frequent, but not always consensual or wanted. In the meantime, check out this video right here on why Gen Z doesn't have sex, or this other video entirely unrelated to sex right over here.